Hello, everyone. Welcome to all of you for joining us today. It's a great honor for me to be welcoming Adam Kahane, who's joining us today from all the way from Montreal. Well, I say all the way for me, I'm based in Switzerland, so it's quite far away, but obviously that depends on where you're watching from. And today we'll be discussing the topic of collaborating across differences to transform whole systems. I really can't imagine a better person to discuss this with us. So it's a great privilege. And first of all, thank you for joining us today, Adam.
My pleasure. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. So today's discussion will last for around an hour, and it is a live discussion after all. So we'd love to open the floor to the viewers at the end. So for the last 15 minutes or so, we'd love to invite your questions. So if you have any questions that pop up at any point during our conversation, if you'd like to just post on YouTube, we'll aim to cover as many as we can at the end. And so without further ado, very excited to introduce our speaker. So Adam Kahane is a director of Reos Partners, which is a global social enterprise that helps businesses, governments, and civil society organizations to work together to address complex challenges. He is a leading architect, organizer, and facilitator of collaboration processes, and he has worked in more than 50 countries in every part of the world with executives, politicians, generals, and guerrillas, civil servants and trade unionists, cabinet ministers, community activists, clergy, and artists on issues including education, health, energy, food, environment, security, development, governance, and peace. So, you know, really a wide range of kind of experiences in different types of areas. And he's also the author of 4 books, including one titled Solving Tough Problems, an open way of talking, listening, and creating new realities, about which Nelson Mandela once said, "This breakthrough book addresses the central challenge of our time, finding a way to work together to solve the problems we have created." And so to I guess kick things off, Adam, when you kind of look at your work and your writings, so much of what you write about and what you work on has been facilitating collaboration between people who don't agree with each other, trust each other, or even like each other. From your perspective, why is this theme of collaboration so important to you? And why can it be so difficult?
Thanks, Bowen. I don't know. I mean, I guess there'd be 2 ways to answer this, but maybe you didn't mean it as a personal question, but I'll take it as a personal question because maybe that's an interesting way to start. You know, some people think you work on you end up working on the thing you end up working in the world on the thing you need to work on yourself. So if I just take that point of view to start with, I would say that my experience in work life, in home life, in community life is that there's lots of potential for misunderstandings and for polarization and for things to grind to a halt and for fragmentation and conflict. And so I've always been drawn to this idea that is there a way to get beyond this? And so my own work has focused on these very big, dramatic, bloody conflicts, first in South Africa and then in Colombia, and these days with my colleagues in many places. But these big, dramatic situations, and yet when I reflect on what is going on in those groups, I see the same dynamics as are going on within organizations, families, my organization, my family. So I think, there's a way of looking at it in which it's all the same everywhere. I mean, I once had a colleague who said, if you're interested in the Paris fashion show, every year it's completely different and every year it's completely the same. So all of these situations are completely different and all of them are the same. So anyhow, that's the way I start. I mean, if you wanted a more abstract answer, you could say that more and more often the situations we're dealing with can't be dealt with from the top down by force. I mean, people can try, and sometimes it works, but as more people are involved and more people have voice and more people have the power to assert themselves and to block things, the harder it is for things to be done unilaterally, and therefore the greater the need is for people to figure out how to work together, how to collaborate. So that's two different ways of answering your question.
Yeah, thanks for that. And yeah, apologies. I think my internet dropped off slightly earlier, but I've just connected to another one, which should be much better. So apologies for that. But yeah, I found it interesting, Adam. One thing that I came across before, kind of, I think listening to one of your talks was that sometimes, especially when we're trying to collaborate in a hierarchical context, that sometimes when we kind of sit together, especially if somebody is more senior, it can be, okay, well, I'll listen to you, we'll listen together, but as long as it's kind of done my way. And I think it is interesting, how, one thing that I find very interesting about what you do is that you can often go into contexts where there are all sorts of different informal relationships. There could be kind of disputes, all sorts of disagreements, but you go in and you really can create this platform where people are starting off on relatively equal footing, and everybody gets heard. But this sounds abstract, but when you're doing that in very, very tense situations with very, very complex challenges, I mean, for me, it feels like it's something that's incredibly difficult to achieve. And so, that's something that yeah, I find very interesting. And I'm not sure if there's anything else you would like to kind of elaborate on that, and how you find a way of facilitating this equality in places where people often just haven't had these discussions or don't necessarily view each other on that equal ground to begin with.
Yeah. No, I think this is really, we're starting in a way in the most important point. So I don't know if it's true that most situations, but many situations are hierarchical. There's a boss and he or she is going to get their way. And, there's certain challenges in that or things to say about that, but that's not what I'm interested in. What I'm interested in is, how do you work in situations where that doesn't apply? Where, yes, different people may have different amounts of power or kinds of power, but at a certain basic level, nobody's the boss of anybody else. So those are the situations that my work focuses on. It's almost always groups of people from different organizations and sectors and communities who may not have an equal amount of money or equal amount of guns or equal amount of votes, but they're not in a directly hierarchical relationship. And therefore, the question isn't about how to get them to be equal. They are, at least in certain respects, equal, or another way to say it is they need each other in order to move forward. That, I may not like the trade union leader or respect her or want to work with her or think she's my equal, but I can't get where I'm trying to go without working with her. So in that sense, my job is not how to, get them to treat each other as equals. It's actually not my job. It's not even possible for me to get anybody to do anything at all. We can come back to that point. But it's rather, if I've already figured out that we need to work together, whether I want to or not, then how can I, in the role of facilitator, help make that happen?
Absolutely. Thank you. And one thing, and I guess, I'm very interested to kind of explore this theme of collaboration with you, which can be quite a broad term in some ways. But I think one thing that I find very interesting about how you say it is that when it comes to collaborating, you mentioned in your book, Collaborating with the Enemy, that conventional constricted collaboration is becoming obsolete. And I'm just curious, kind of, what do you mean by collaboration here in that context? And in what ways would you say that it is becoming obsolete? And what do you think are some ways that, or what ought to maybe take its place? Yeah, just on mute, Adam.
Sorry. So let's start with the basics. So the word collaboration just means to work together, and I'm saying collaboration is a way of moving forward that's different from forcing, different from adapting, and different from exiting. So doesn't mean we always have to collaborate with everybody on everything. That wouldn't be possible. There may be lots of occasions where legitimately or practically or in other senses we want to and can force or adapt or exit. But I'm interested in the case, what if we really do need to work with others? How do we do so? And the point I've made that you're referring to here is there's a conventional way of thinking about what that means, a conventional way of imagining collaboration. And it has the following recipe, that first of all, we have to focus on the good of the whole, the good and the harmony of the whole. Let's leave our agendas at the door. Let's keep our eye on what we have in common, not what's different, and what we're trying to achieve together. Secondly, we need to agree on what the problem is, and then agree on what the solution is, and then agree on the plan to implement the solution. And then finally, we have to agree who's going to do what. And my argument is that in complex contexts where people have voice, where they have opinions and power of their own of one sort or another, then that conventional approach does not and cannot work. And so if we're going to collaborate in those contexts, we need a different way. And in summary, the different way is it's not just about the whole, it's about the multiple wholes, the parts and the wholes. There's not one that's more important than the other. Normally when people say, let's just focus on the whole, what they really mean is, let's just focus on the whole that matters to me. So that has to change. And recognizing the differences and conflict that presents. Secondly, we're almost never going to be able to agree on the problem, the solution, and the plan. Situation's too complex, there's too much conflict. We're just going to have to make our way one step at a time, see what works. And thirdly, and most fundamentally, when people say, well, for the situation to change, people need to change what they're doing, they almost always mean other people need to change what they're doing. And in a horizontal context, I can't get anybody to do anything, literally. And so it really, thinking about what other people ought to do is ultimately a complete waste of time. And so in what I call stretch collaboration, this unconventional, uncomfortable collaboration, in the end, the only thing that matters is, okay, what am I going to do next? So anyway, that's a long way of saying that in the current context, this conventional approach can't work, never works, or and we need another approach, which is the one I've outlined.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and stretch collaboration is I think Yeah, is a very interesting idea that I'd love to kind of dig a bit further with you. But one thing, just I guess to kind of build on that, one thing that I found quite interesting is that you sometimes say that, you know, when we're kind of coming together to collaborate in these very kind of often difficult, challenging environments, it's on one level it is about kind of suspending, I think you say, our opinions and our views while we're collaborating, but it's not for you to say or for us to kind of think that I'm just going to put everything aside and just kind of try to agree for the common good, because often that can be not necessarily the best outcome either. And often it's kind of this balancing, this dynamic between, you know, expressing your views and, you know, occasionally your differences when they arise, but also being aware of that whole. And I'm quite curious, you know, from your own perspective in these kind of workshops that you do, how do you kind of help to kind of guide this balance and between describing your own differences, but also being aware of that whole? It seems like quite a nuanced kind of balance to try and reach.
Yeah, so there's a word, I think it was coined by Arthur Kessler. It's a very simple word, but it's not used very often. It's the word holon, Holon, and holon is a whole that's part of a larger whole. So in a way, I'm saying something very ordinary. It's obviously true that I'm a whole in myself, and you and I are part of the whole of the people in this conversation, but I'm part of other wholes. There's a household around me. My wife's in the next room. My kids and grandkids are somewhere else. I'm part of that whole. I'm part of the whole of Reos Partners, where there's other things happening today that I have to keep an eye on. You're part of other organizations. So we're all part of multiple wholes. And this is, if I can put it this way, just the reality of the situation. And if we're going to have a fruitful interaction, we have to be aware of that. So you asked me, Adam, could we start a half an hour early? That would work better for the people I've invited to this, but I had this other thing I needed to do and I couldn't do that. So anyhow, this is a simple situation, but it's a situation that occurs all the time. And you couldn't and didn't and wouldn't be able to say, Adam, I'm sorry, the YouTube conversation we're having is the only thing that matters. I need you to put everything else aside. No, that would be illegitimate, unrealistic and illegitimate. So once we realize this, we can relax around the fact that yes, we're all holons, we're all part of multiple wholes, and we're coming together to do what we can given that reality. And furthermore, it will be helpful for me to reveal to you some of the other things going on in my situation that you need to know. Well, in this very simple case, I needed to tell you, no, I had this other thing going on, because otherwise we couldn't figure out how we were going to have this conversation. And so part of it is just making it discussable and making it more visible. What are the other wholes each of us are part of? And the good news about this, there's a famous phrase of the humanistic psychologist Carl Rogers, who said, what is most personal is most universal. That actually, when I share with you the things that are most particular to me about my family situation or my health or my life or my dreams or whatever, actually, that's the place that you and I are most likely to be able to connect at, even more than our abstract concerns, for example, about this webinar. So making discussable and revealing and creating opportunities for people to be aware of the whole of each person and how it connects to the whole of their joint activity. That's what's involved.
Yes. Yeah, I like how you put that, you know, at any one time, I mean, one way of viewing it is that there are these different contexts in a way that we're in, whether it's the family context or kind of, you know, business context and everything else. And in a way, sometimes we go into, you know, an interaction and we say, oh, well, this is purely professional, say, or this is purely something else. But actually, I guess it's a question to what extent we bring everything else. And in a way, we are whole human beings. So we should be bringing our whole selves.
It doesn't, you know, I don't want to be misunderstood. It doesn't mean that every conversation has to be about my family or my company or whatever. But if I take the other extreme, if I insist that in this conversation we only talk about the thing we have in common, our joint project, and nothing else is allowed to come into it, other priorities, other imperatives, other pressures, other realities, other lives, then it's very possible we'll get stuck and we won't even know why we're stuck. Why does Bowen keep bringing this thing up? Well, if I knew it's because Bowen actually has this other thing he's trying to sort out or that he needs to get done, you know, maybe this will be difficult for me, or maybe I'll say, oh, Bowen, why didn't you tell me? Now I get it. Yeah, sure, we can do this. We can. So yeah, it's recognizing not only that we're each a whole, but we're all part of multiple wholes. And the one that's on the table for the meeting or the workshop or the project is just part of what's going on.
Yeah. And yeah, and I'd love to open this up a bit as well. I mean, and I'm curious, what are some things that you're currently involved in, currently working on, some things that, yeah, that kind of, that you find either exciting these days or yeah, things that you're, yeah, just, I guess, just to outline a bit of some things that you're working on these days and how it relates to maybe some of your previous work or.
Yeah, well, Reos Partners is a pretty big organization. There's 50 of us working on lots of things in different parts of the world, in Australia and Myanmar and Syria and Chile and the Netherlands and my home country of Canada. So lots of different things at the same time. And also learning, like everybody, how to do this without the opportunity of bringing large groups of people together in person.
Yeah.
And finding that obviously that presents some challenges or some difficulties because certainly I'm used to working with people in person, and the coffee breaks and the meals and the walks and the sessions in the bar are a large part of why we're able to move things along. So it's not automatic that the same things can happen on Zoom. On the other hand, for example, it's possible to bring people together who are in completely different parts of the world, as you and I are, for zero cost. So there's opportunities as well. So that's one of the things we're working on, is how do we do these collaborations, including collaborations among people who don't know each other or like or trust each other, who don't agree. How do we do that in a way that works in this new context where we can't, or most of us can't be together physically? So that's something we're working on. And if you'd asked me 2 months ago, I would have said, can't be done. Let's just wait till we get back to the old world. But I don't know when we're going to get back to the old world. And we're finding that this works better than we thought it would. And I'm sure even when we are able to travel, that much more will take place in this medium. So that's one thing. I guess a second thing is I've been thinking for some time about, yeah, how do power differences and violent differences and questions of race and class and other kinds of differences and oppression, how does that play into this work? And what do I need to do differently as a facilitator, as a consultant, as a old white man in this work? So that's the second thing that's very alive in me and in Reos and in all our contexts. And then finally, as I think you know, I'm writing another book now. So that's a particular book is my side work. My main work is doing this work on specific complex problematic situations. But every few years I try to figure out, what am I learning? What are we learning about this? And so what I'm trying to write about now is what specific capacities does this require of the facilitator? In other words, rather than simply what does stretch collaboration look like, what specifically does stretch facilitation look like? If my job is to help groups of stakeholders work together in this unconventional stretch way rather than this conventional rigid way, then what does that require of me as the organizer and facilitator? So those are some of the things that I'm spending my time on these days.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I appreciate, it's we're all going through a lot of changes. I mean, all of our meetings now tend to be via Zoom, and it is a different dynamic. I mean, as you say, the meeting ends, and often at that point you would talk about it, you would, offload about, what happened and all of the in-between things that maybe you didn't get to kind of discuss. And yeah, I can imagine it's very different, especially for you in your work, Adam. And I think this role of facilitator is very interesting, especially, I mean, we are a complexity theory systems thinking platform. And one of the things that, that really intrigues a lot of our listeners is, how do we go about, however you want to frame it, solving complex challenges or approaching these very complex challenges that we might face. And one thing that becomes quite apparent is that when it's not clear what's even happening, never mind the solution, you can't have one person who just happens to know the right way to tell everybody to follow, and kind of almost the conventional method of leadership. And it kind of promotes more importance in the ability to connect and the ability to open spaces for people to come together to share their views. And just, I guess, continuing more on that thread about your new book, I understand it's still very much a work in progress, but what do you see as some kind of themes that are popping out, or some things in particular that are interesting to you that seem to be kind of arising that you might want to share?
Yeah, so just coming back to the point you've made, I think we're very rarely in a situation where it's a problem that we can define and solve. So that's why I learned a long time ago to use this awkward construction, problematic situation. It's a situation that different people understand in different ways and find problematic from different perspectives. So that's why, in fact, the very first thing, the first chapter in the book is about how can we, bring to bear different perspectives and experiences and aspects of the problematic situation, rather than the one right answer about the way things are. So it's interesting that you you said it that way because in my thinking, that's the first step, or anyhow, the order of the steps maybe is not the crucial thing, but that's a foundational step, which is how can we hear and ask about and inquire into different perspectives on what's going on, and be humble enough to realize that, yeah, I have my understanding, I have my way of looking at it, and it may have value, but that's not the only thing that can be said about it. And that's why I consider this word suspending to be so valuable, that when I suspend my thinking, if I imagine I take my thought and I put it on a string and I hang it in front of me, what that means is I'm saying, this is how I think about things. So I'm able to look at it, you're able to look at it, you may disagree, you may attack it, you're not attacking me. Maybe at the end of the conversation, I'll say, yeah, okay, thanks, but I still think about it that way. But the act of suspending gives me the opportunity to say, well, actually, I think there's more to it than I was imagining, and I now think about this differently than I did at the beginning of the conversation. I had a colleague in South Africa named Louis van der Merwe who used to joke that when you find yourself pounding the table, certain about your understanding of the truth about the way things are, just put at the beginning of the sentence, in my opinion, and if that's not enough, put in my humble opinion. So I've always liked that, because these phrases, this phrase, in my humble opinion, is just a reminder that, yes, it's a reminder that what I'm doing now is suspending. So I do consider this to be foundational. It's not the only thing involved, and that's the ability of all of us to do that, and the ability of the facilitator to do that. And so in that regard, I consider the normal facilitator. So often what facilitators do is they say, yes, everybody else must keep an open mind and suspend, but in my case, I'm the expert on the process, and I insist that you trust the process. So this is not congruent. And so I would say that I also need to be able to suspend in that role as facilitation.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm going to close a window because we've got somebody else.
No worries. No worries.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry.
No worries. Yeah, that really resonated, and one thing that really comes to mind, and it could be a slight tangent, but one thing that I found kind of going to mindfulness actually, and suddenly it puts this big lens on the ego, is that suddenly you start to shift your thinking a little bit from, this is my idea, and you really kind of grasp onto this idea and it's a reflection of yourself, and that there isn't really this detachment or this suspension, as you say, that it's just an idea and it can change, and I'm open to new perspectives, and suddenly you flip to, it's a thought. It could be prompted by the environment. I don't necessarily have to describe with it, and it's a choice of whether or not I decide to let it pass or I can internalize it more, but it's a choice. And you mentioned that this is something that the facilitator can be an important role for the facilitator, and I'm curious if you have any examples of maybe either things you've read or personal experiences where maybe certain kind of actions or ways of describing how people come together can help people to be more open, I guess, to the perspectives of others, and actually start to kind of suspend their views.
Yeah, so it's a great, I hadn't thought of that, that aspect of mindfulness. yeah, so that not being attached to, yeah, to my idea or my understanding or me, and to realize there's some tentativeness about all of that. On the other hand, I wouldn't go to the other extreme of saying that, yeah, I don't know the straightforward way of saying that, but I think the ego and the commitment and the determination and the, if suspending is about holding loosely, what's the other side of this is about, yeah, I have a point of view and I'm gonna push it and try to get something done. So all of this, in the end, the book I'm writing is about dilemmas or polarities, and that's one of them. In this case, the polarity between asking or listening on the one hand and telling on the other. And I wouldn't want to flip from one extreme to the other. The question you ask about how to do that, I've been thinking a lot, and I've written recently. I have a column in Strategy and Business, and I wrote a column on this idea of the paired walk. It's always, for years in our work, for many years, one thing we've done in workshops is the following. Look around the room, find somebody you think is very different from you, and go for a walk with them, 30, 45-minute walk. And it's interested me because you couldn't have a simpler exercise. It doesn't even require the facilitator. It's something done in pairs. It's a completely natural thing to walk next to somebody, or if you don't want to walk or you can't walk, to sit next to them. But it's always interested me that participants in workshops frequently say, wow, this was really the best part of the workshop. Can we do it again? And so I've been thinking about what happens when you go for a walk with somebody. And technically, there are certain things that happen. I'm not sitting there opposite you. I'm side by side. We're looking at the world together. We're moving through it. We're not looking at our papers. We're looking at the world. So there's certain mechanical aspects which I think are important. But I had a wonderful conversation last year with a colleague in Mexico, a theologian named Lucila Cerviche, who suggested to me there's a more profound thing that's going on, which is the following. When I walk side by side with somebody at a very ordinary level, we're accepting each other simply as people. And so the first thing that happens is I'm accepted as a human being. And it's because I am accepted and I feel accepted that I might be willing to review or suspend or revise my thinking about things. And her point was that this sequence, that first I'm accepted and secondly I change, is opposite to the conventional sequence, for example, in the Catholic confessional, she's a Catholic theologian, where first you apologize and then you're accepted. So I really thought this was interesting. And so what this points to is that the crucial thing, or the first thing, or the thing from which other things flow, is this idea that I see you as a human being. It's related to this point about what's personal is most universal. That first we try out seeing each other as fellow humans, fellow whole humans. And that is what allows us to suspend or maybe change or do something different. So that's something that I think is really important.
Yes. it's almost like sometimes, especially when there are differences between, well, or at least you perceive differences between yourself and someone else, which when you're in a context of, I guess, wanting to collaborate, it can come up. Often, almost maybe the first response is, and I think I've seen you kind of talk or write about this before, that it's if only that person could just do it the way that I want, then everything will be fine. And often you say that in collaboration context, that's kind of almost the starting point, you know, before you get deeper into almost the compassion and the empathy with each other, which takes time and takes treating each other as individuals, that there is this barrier of this is different and it's uncomfortable. And
yeah, but I would push it, if you don't mind, Bowen, because I think what's possible is that we'll get to know each other and we'll find, you know, there really is a difference between us, and there really is a conflict or a disagreement, or and it may be something very serious. I remember years ago in a workshop in a hotel, working with a group of people in a hotel meeting room, and there was on the other side of the hallway there was another meeting. I think it was a convention of people in the tattoo business. So my fellow facilitator, who's always trying to seize the moment, Betty Sue Flowers, said, "Hey," said to the group, "we're going to take a break now, a coffee break in the hallway. Why don't each of you talk to somebody from that group across the hall, because they're also on their coffee break." And we were working with a business group of political and business leaders. And so this was a big adventure for them. They were going to talk to people in the tattooing business. And many of them came back after the break and said, you know, I talked to this guy. I thought he was really scary, but, you know, I found we have a lot in common. I talked to this. So I also did the exercise, and I talked to a guy who had a tattoo, and I asked him what it was. And he said, oh, yeah. Well, I had to get this tattoo. Actually, the one I like much better is under it, but I had to cover it up. I said, what's the one under it? He said, it's a swastika. So here's a case where I got to know him a little bit better, and I found, wow, we actually have a very serious and maybe irreconcilable difference. So what I'm trying to push on is it's not necessarily true that we'll have a little disagreement and we'll find it was all a misunderstanding. We actually agreed. Actually, we're almost certainly going to have differences. It's not maybe, but almost always. And some of the time, these are going to be differences we can't resolve. And so for me, what's more interesting is the question, how can I work with people who I do not agree with and may never agree with? Because I think that's a more realistic, or that also happens a lot. And yeah, and that rather than if we don't agree on everything, I just can't do anything with that person. Yeah. And the people who I think understand this quite well are politicians. And, you know, it's fashionable to say, man, these people are such politicians. But I view this as a very skillful part of politics. The understanding that that we may have disagreements, even fundamental ones, fundamentally different ambitions. We're in competition. We don't agree. We represent different interests. But nonetheless, a lot of the time we have to figure out how are we going to get this thing done, because we both need to get it done. And that ability to work with people you don't agree with and may never agree with, to me, is a very great skill.
Yes, I have to say this is something that, you know, when I encountered your work, came as a bit of it unearthed my own, I guess, biases towards this, because I used to think that collaboration and disagreement or conflict were pretty much on almost on opposite sides of the spectrum. And if there was deep conflicts, say, that were not reconciled and that you had, you know, this environment of relative harmony, that it's a direct barrier to collaboration. But what I found interesting is that it, from what you were communicating, it didn't seem that that was necessarily the case. That actually, in true collaboration, there are often disagreements, and there are disagreements that you cannot just wish away or just brush aside. And I guess the question, and I know that this is quite a large question, but how do we collaborate when we've spoken with someone who realized that there are these differences and neither of us are willing to put it aside, but yet we still know that we need to collaborate to get this done. How do we approach that?
Yeah, well, I don't mean to be flippant, but have you ever been married? I mean,
I do have a fiance, so soon to be.
Yeah, so I don't have any greater unique wisdom on being married, but I've been married for almost 30 years, and I think it was there's a famous researcher on marriage. His name is Goffman, I think John Goffman, and he's has a huge clinical practice, and he's studied tens of thousands of couples, and has a statistic something like 62% of marriage disagreements revolve around fundamentally irreconcilable differences. I like to sleep with the window open. My spouse likes to sleep with it closed. There's not going to be an agreement on that. So his point is, I think it's true, and I think it's important. His conclusion from the marriage counseling business is the difference between successful and unsuccessful marriages, or marriages that last and marriages that don't, is not whether you manage to agree, but can you find a way to live with these permanent disagreements? So I'm saying this just to say this, for me, is not an extraordinary situation. This is a very ordinary situation. And I think it takes a very particular kind of, what's the right word, arrogance, to imagine that if we don't agree, then we can't work together. And it relates a bit to this thing we were talking about at the beginning about hold-ons. I mean, we're not one, we're two, or many, and we have different realities, and our work together is part of those realities, but all kinds of other things are going on. I made myself unpopular at my son's wedding when he asked me to give the wedding speech that I gave what he considered an overly academic discourse. But I still think the thing I said, maybe it wasn't appropriate as a wedding speech, but I still think it's really true. And I said that I thought that getting married was about becoming one, but also about becoming more properly two. And so both things are true. And yeah, I think successful marriages or working relationships or projects are about, how can we make progress together, recognizing that we're not the same, and there may be aspects of our lives or our perspectives or our interests that are just not going to get reconciled. And the main point I'm making, Bowen, is this is not an exceptional circumstance. This is true, I hate to say 100% of the time, but probably at least 99% of the time. So I think we have to stop treating it as the exception that requires some special fix, but more the normal state of the world when different people are working together.
Yeah, no, thanks for grounding in that there. And I had a question, but it just left me. I'm not sure if this is a good time to delve a little bit into your work with power and love, because I think you said earlier that often the things that are most universal are things that are most personal. And what I found interesting was how when you first introduced, maybe you'd just like to share a bit the story of when you first you were writing this book and you were in this interesting kind of political context, and you had kind of this realization of these two different groups that were rising. Would you just like to, share that story? Yeah.
Well, so I do have something I'd like to say about that and how I used to think about it and how I'm changing my thinking about it, but I didn't know whether you still wanted to, are there questions, or is actually nobody listening? So it's just the two of us for the next 9 minutes.
No. It's streamed on YouTube. So
okay, but I didn't know whether you wanted to engage with other people.
Sorry, yes. The time I've been completely.
So whatever you want, I can answer your question. I guess the one sentence,
sure,
or please. The 1 minute version is, yes, I've thought a lot about how this relates to power, to power and love, and these are words that have a lot of meanings, but I'm using those words in a very specific way. And for a long time, I've relied on a very provocative sentence in one of the final speeches of Martin Luther King Jr., where he says, "Power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic." So I've thought a lot about it, and I've written a book called Power and Love, which is about what does it take to engage both of these. And the thing I'm working on now, which I think is you could say a more general theory, is about not just power, the drive to self-realization, and love, the drive to reunification, but also justice. And what does it mean to work with all three of these drives, power, love, and justice, where justice is the structure that enables, or let me say it in a simpler way, injustice is the structure that enables one party to remove the power of the others, to kneel on their neck, if you want a visceral image and example. So I'm arguing that actually the core, the core of lots of things, but in this case, the core of facilitating is being able to work with those three dimensions of the work: power, love, and justice. And this is the organizing theme for the book I'm writing now.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you for that summary. And yes, Adam, you're totally right. Time just flew by for me. And yes, I would love to have a look at the questions from the audience. So the first question is, how does one measure the impact of collaborative change and complex solutions?
Yeah, well, so I'll give a simple answer, but this is how I think about it, that you're collaborating because you're trying to deal with a problematic situation. You've come together because you're trying to make things different than the way they are now. So the simple answer is, did the collaboration achieve that objective? Did you find a way by working together to affect the transformation or change that you intended to? Maybe in a different way than you thought you would, but so it goes back to, why have you come together? What is it you're trying to achieve? And measuring that, which of course is different in every case.
Yeah.
If you've just met and worked together but not managed to have any impact on the problematic situation, then you haven't done what you came together to do.
Yep, thank you. And yeah, as you say, of course, it really depends on what you sought out to do and measuring against that. Next question is, how do you ensure that the collaboration is sustainable?
So I know I said this earlier, but I'll come back to it because I do consider it to be fundamental. The phrase is, how do you ensure, how do you get, how do you make? I know these are common ways of phrasing questions. I'm not picking on the questioner, but they also betray a real, what I consider to be an entirely unrealistic starting point or assumption, which is that you can insure or get or make anything. And so, you know, the best you can do is take a step forward and decide what you're going to do, take a step forward, and then see what you're going to do next. So, sorry for the pedantic beginning of the answer. But I guess now that I put it that way, it also is a way of answering the question, which is the effort will be sustainable, or let me say the effort will be sustained if the stakeholders think that they're making progress, that they're getting something out of it, that working together is enabling them to get towards where they're trying to go better than not collaborating, better than staying in their own organizations or offices. And so this willingness to keep pausing and saying, how are we doing? What do we need to keep doing? What do we need to do different? I've written an article about this as well, this so-called Delta Plus process, which we do in Reos. Seems like every hour, but at least every project stage, which is to stop and say, what are we doing? What do we need to be doing? What do we need to do differently next time? Not what should we have done, because there's no do-overs, but what do we want to change going forward, and what do we want to keep doing going forward? And I think if you have a discipline of asking that question fearlessly and being willing to pivot, then you have a higher probability of having sustained and successful effort.
Yeah. And I like, because sometimes these are subtle things, but how you frame, how you articulate it in your mind does make a difference. And actually, I hadn't come across that before, but yeah, there are no do-overs, not what you would do differently, go backwards, because that's kind of irrelevant almost in a way. It's moving forwards. What will we do differently? Thank you for that. And
the other small thing in that is energetically, it's interesting to do the delta before the plus, because the delta of, sometimes involves realizing, man, I really don't want to do that again. That was really, didn't work at all. And the plus is about what am I doing? Maybe something obvious, but I don't want to forget to keep doing. So again, the subtle thing about doing the delta before the plus.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. I'm just aware of time. Are you able to stay on for a couple of minutes, or do you have to? Fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, we have a few more questions. This is an interesting question. How does one manage to communicate to people in unequal positions, whether in terms of power or resources, etc., that we need each other without sounding patronizing?
Yeah, so it's a very important question. It's a very important question, and it doesn't have an easy answer, but the version of the question that I wrestle with, or I hear and I wrestle with most often is, I need to work with Mary, but Mary doesn't think she needs to work with me because Mary's happy with the way things are going, or Mary has the power to make things the way she wants them to be. So the power difference and the working together come in right at the very beginning. And the inadequacy of saying how, what probably won't work is, how can I convince Mary of this? Because that's again falling into that same trap of how can I get Mary to do this thing I want Mary to do? What's more likely to be successful is one of two strategies. Firstly, can I understand how things look from Mary's perspective? And there may be a way in which the situation is problematic also for her, although maybe in a different way than it's problematic for me, but provides us a basis to work together. That Mary says, well, I don't actually agree that this part of it's a problem, but I think this part of it's a problem. And so let's see if we can address my issue and your issue by working together, rather than insisting that Mary agree at the beginning that my framing is correct. Now, so that would be one way. The other way is, well, Mary just understands what I want and Mary doesn't care because Mary is getting what she wants and doesn't see any need to work with me. So then, what can I do to help Mary see things differently? And does that involve organizing a protest outside Mary's office so that this thing she thinks is going well, maybe she realizes isn't going so well? So anyhow, and this gets into but both of those are different from how can I convince Mary that she should do what I want her to do, which I find in general to be a waste of time.
Yes. And the first one especially seemed to be the difference between the two scenarios. Was one started with, I don't understand, but I'm going to try to at least have a level of empathy. And the other is, I can see something's not how I want it, and I'm just going to try and push my will on that a little bit.
Yeah, and I don't, I'm not in principle opposed to forcing. There are times when forcing is the only option or a legitimate option or a legal option. I'm not saying you should never force anything. I actually think forcing is, for most people, the default option. If I can get things to be the way I want them to be, then I will. But what I'm interested in, to go back to the beginning of our conversation, is what if forcing doesn't work? What if forcing, adapting, and exiting don't work? And therefore I'm left with, I need to work with these other people, even if I don't agree with or like or trust them, because otherwise I can't, there's no other way to get where I'm trying to go.
Yeah, thanks for that. So this question is, what if collaboration in a stretch collaboration limit each other and their potential to achieve the solution they personally think is right?
Sorry, I don't think I understand. Could you say it? Could you read it again?
The question is, what if collaborators, in a stretch collaboration actually limit each other and their potential to achieve the solution they personally think is right?
So it's an interesting question. I hadn't thought of it that way. And so I'm not sure whether this answers the question this person is asking, but I'll come back to what I said a minute ago, which is that if I have this thing that I think is right and I can achieve it without collaborating, and that's then why not just go for it? I think it's obviously not true that I need to collaborate with everybody on everything. That would be a ridiculous idea. So I'm trying to reframe collaboration as a choice, something you do some of the time when you need to. But no, I don't need to collaborate with everybody on everything. And it may be collaborating with that person is actually going to make it harder rather than easier for me to get where I'm trying to go, in which case don't do it. So to me, I know I'm repeating myself, but to me, this is very important that collaboration is not the only option.
It's not the silver bullet. And
yeah, if I put it in the extreme way, it's obviously it's obviously physically impossible to collaborate with everybody on everything. So it's a choice. So when are you going to do it? And this is the main theme of the book, or the first chapter of the book, Collaborating with the Enemy, is that collaboration is not the only option.
Yeah, thank you. And then final question from the audience. How do you deal with online echo chambers that stop cross collaborations?
Yeah, I think it's really important, and I don't know if it's a new phenomena, but a newish phenomena. Online and new media, this common discourse. I have a friend who used to be an older friend who used to be a newspaper writer, and he's in Montreal, and he said, there were whatever 2 newspapers, and everybody read them or read one of them, and so there was some common reference points of facts and opinions and ideas, and the fragmentation of media is a way in which, the extreme is an echo chamber where I'm only listening to people who agree with me. And I would put it, I think it's worse than that. It's that I consider those other people to not be simply wrong, but bad, and maybe the devil. So for me, what the problem is not just an echo chamber, but a process of demonization. I mean that literally. Why I could collaborate with anybody, but not with the devil, not with those people. It's not that I disagree with them. It's not just they're wrong, they're evil. And I'm not saying we never have enemies or there are never evil people. I'm not going that far, but I don't think we have as many enemies or as many evil people as we imagine. And so this media phenomena or the social phamena is making it harder to collaborate. And that's the process I call in my book enemifying, the construction of enemies. Doesn't mean we don't have any enemies, but we don't have as many as we make.
Yeah, and it goes to this whole mentality of us versus them, which is we could say in so many ways the root of a lot of the issues that we see today. But I'm aware of time, and thank you, Adam, for agreeing to stay on a bit longer. I mean, personally, I found this deeply insightful, and I wanted to thank you so much for joining us today. And I guess this goes to our viewers as well. If these ideas you found interesting and you like the topics that we talk about, I'd highly recommend that you dig further into the work of Adam Kahane. We've got links in the description. So I would highly recommend you have a look at that.
Well, thanks, Bowen. I enjoyed the conversation. I've made a lot of notes about things I've learned that I need to get in the next book. And I think one of the links you have in the description is a link to the book that I'm writing now. So I'm in a experiment in co-creation and collaboration. I'm releasing drafts of that book to people who are willing to read it and make comments on it. And several hundred people are doing that. And so I invite the people to click on that link, particularly if you're willing to try to figure this out with me. And there's links to the books that are already published as well, and to the project work of Reos Partners. So thanks for your great questions. And I've got lots of notes. So I learned a lot as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam. Appreciate it a lot. Have a great day.